Hello, and welcome to the monthly program, Our St. Paul, Learn with the League. I'm Cheryl Bailey, member of the program committee, and we'd like to give many thanks to the White Bear Lake area and Roseville area leagues for their support of tonight's talk on Minnesota's current childcare climate. The St. Paul Neighborhood Network and suburban community channels are once again broadcasting and taping tonight's program. You can check the St. Paul League's YouTube site anytime to view previous programs. Let's acknowledge that we're learning today on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota and the current home of Native nations, including the Dakota and Ojibwe. Our program is being recorded. We're broadcasting on Facebook Live in addition to Zoom. And by now, I figure you know the drill on how to type in your questions. Please forgive the occasional bloopers from the auto-generated Zoom closed caption feature. Tonight's guest speakers are especially focused on early childhood and the importance of how our society supports children and their families. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Megan Gunnar, who's a distinguished McKnight University professor at the U of M. Dr. Gunnar earned her PhD from Stanford University, and her career has focused on stress psychology in the developing child and the importance of adults who care for and interact with children. She's the principal investigator in the International Adoption Project and has studied children in Russian and Romanian orphanages before and after adoption. She runs the Gunnar Lab for Developmental Psychobiology Research and is on the Governor's Advisory Council to the Children's Cabinet. Our second speaker is Amy Wazlawik. She's the principal assistant to Ramsey County Commissioner Nicole Frethem. Ms. Wazlawik was a state legislator in District 38B. She has a keen interest in early childhood education policy, and she's earned her master's degree in social policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Ms. Wazlawik is closely attuned to this legislative session and will update us on the remaining bills working their way through the process until the end of session, May 22nd. She also has years of experience working with children. So before we have our speakers, I'd like to start with a quick poll. You know the drill by now, 1, 2, 3, or 4. If you could make a guess as to how much it costs to have one 2-year-old child in a daycare center, a childcare center in the Twin Cities. $1,000 a week, $1,500. Nobody's saying $2,000 a week. Not many think it's more than $2,000. Okay, most people think it's between $1,000 and $1,500 a week. Next slide. There we go. Well, the answer is, if somebody could minimize the poll results, $6,200 a month for one 2-year-old child in a daycare center. Any chance we can get the poll off? Maybe I can do it. I'm the one who had to do that. Sorry about that. So $1,500 a week for kids from 3 months old to 2 years. And if you could go to the next slide, look at how much from the parents' point of view they would have to earn in order to pay for one 2-year-old child to go to a childcare center. They've got to make at least $40 an hour with no taxes taken out and work full time. And their entire salary then will go to the childcare for that one child. Just imagine having more than one child. Next slide. So you read that right. It costs more to send your child to childcare than a 4-year state university, according to Aaron Sojourner and his colleagues at the W.E. Upjohn Institute. He presented a very well-received slideshow to the Minnesota House this session, and I think his last sentence is really helpful. Finding solutions to such a big problem is going to require a coordinated approach. It's especially difficult from the daycare providers, from the childcare providers' perspective, to think of all their extremely hard work and the relatively poor compensation they receive. The workforce is predominantly female. It's been running on fumes for years and has really showed the strain during and after COVID. Rural areas feel even more pressure given the fewer potential employees. So tonight we're going to learn from the experts that brain development in the very young absolutely relies on adults nudging it along. We can go to the next slide. High quality childcare, if parents are working outside the home, is very costly. And we certainly do not spend enough time or resources on the critical early years in children's lives. And so we're missing the golden chance to make a positive impact with public dollars. And we need a much broader policy position to achieve affordable, high quality childcare in the United States. The league itself does not have a specific official policy on childcare. So we're going to pivot to Dr. Megan Gunnar, and I'm going to turn my video off as soon as I see the whites of her eyes. There she is.
There you go.
Welcome, Dr. Gunnar, and thank you.
Hello.
Look forward to your presentation.
Okay, can you all see this? I hope. Can you see my slides?
Looks good. Yep.
All right. So what I'm going to do is give you sort of the deep background on why the early years are important for brain development. And then we will pivot to my colleague who will be able to talk to you about high quality childcare and the challenges that are faced there. So this is not specifically about childcare, but it is about why we are all together, because you all are a part of the league, because you believe that a foundation, we care about a successful society. And I'm here to argue that the foundation for a successful society is really built in early childhood. It's built on the backs of high quality early brain development. This forms the foundation for educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, and we're increasingly understanding for lifelong health. These pillars support strong communities, healthy economy, and successful parenting of the next generation. Is always a 2 or 3 generation issue that we have to be looking at. So what does it take to build a healthy brain? Well, it takes more than just having the right genes. Yes, there are genetic anomalies that make it difficult to have a healthy brain, but what we are understanding increasingly that it also takes the right supportive experiences, and that these experiences literally write on our genes and determine how our genes develop. And this is a process that's called, maybe you've heard of it, it's called epigenetics. Epi means over, and this is our commands, in a sense, laid over the top of our genes. Now, your genes lie on your chromosomes, and you have a really long set of DNA, and it gets folded up and wrapped into your chromosomes. It wraps around these little protein balls called histones. And if it's really tightly wound, then it cannot get messages from the environment of the cells, which come from the environment of the body, which ultimately can come from the outside sources. It can't get those messages to turn on its genes. The area has to be opened, in a sense, in order to receive information, transcription factors that regulate gene transcription and turning into proteins. And those little yellow things there are called methyl marks. And those methyl marks, when they're placed along the DNA, cause the DNA to wrap itself up very tightly so that you cannot get messages to those genes. Now, this is absolutely important because, as you know, if you take your genes from any part of your body, they're the same genes. So the genes in your cheek cells are the same as the genes in your liver, is the same as the genes in your kidneys, but obviously they don't function the same way, or you'd be a single-celled organism. So what happens during the course of differentiation of the fetus is that genes in different regions get silenced so that they act like the genes for the liver and the kidney and the spleen. But this continues to happen after we're born, and it continues to help adapt us to the environments in which we are born, that we're born into. And this is an example of it from studies of rhesus monkeys reared with and without their mothers. What they've done in this study, and there were 4 monkeys in each of the groups, and they were sacrificed, which is very sad to think about, but they were sacrificed at about 6 months of age. Pieces of the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain that's involved in thinking and reasoning in this case, were taken out. And the genes in those cells were analyzed for the number of methyl marks that they contain, how tightly wound they would have been made around those histone proteins. And the more tightly wound they are, the more red it is, the more methylated. And the more green, the less methylated. And you don't need statistics to see that the 4 monkeys on the left, who were reared with their mothers, have a very different pattern of methylation along over 1,300 genes in the promoter, the region of the gene that helps to determine whether the gene is going to turn itself on, than the ones who are reared on a cloth surrogate without a mother. This is not because nature hates you, but because this is a mechanism of adapting the infant to its environment so that it will function and behave differently as a function of its experiences. Now, the other way that experience is critically important in shaping our brain architecture is by regulating which connections we keep and which we prune. What you're again looking at here is a region from the prefrontal cortex. It doesn't have to be, but it is from the prefrontal cortex. Those things that you're seeing on the left, those are actually nerve cells. And in order for a nerve cell to do anything, it has to talk to other nerve cells. And as you can see, these guys aren't connected up, which is why, the prefrontal cortex is there for thinking and reasoning, and it's a newborn in this example, and they don't do a whole lot of thinking and reasoning. But what's going to happen around 6 years of age in this part of the brain is that suddenly there'll be an overproliferation under genetic control, overproliferation of all these connections, more than is actually efficient. And then what nature has figured out is so slick is that over the next few years, the connections that get used are kept. They're in a sense fed and they're strengthened, and the ones that are not are pruned away, so that the brain, in essence, becomes what the brain thinks about. And this happens at different times in different parts of the brain. It happens, in essence, from the back to the front, because the back part is involved in sensory pathways, vision and hearing, which is what babies get good at first. And then areas that are involved in language. And finally, areas for a much longer time that are involved in higher cognition. But what's important to note is that much of this is getting laid down in the first years of life. You never solve a problem with only one part of your brain. And what happens with your vision, your hearing, and your language influences higher order cognitive functioning as well. So we know that babies who maybe have a lesion in the back part of their brain ultimately will see it affecting how the kids are functioning in higher order cognitive areas. Skills begets skills. So what we laid out in the earliest years of life set us up for learning for the rest of our lives. And then you have to wonder, what was nature thinking? I mean, seriously, stimulation is needed for the brain to develop. And we are born among the most helpless of mammals on the planet. This brain that has to be this amazing thing, it can't provide itself with the stimulation it needs in order to develop normally. It's just not possible. Baby can't get its hand to its mouth, can't see more than about 6 inches in front of its face, can't roll over, can't do anything. A monkey is much better off at providing the stimulation it needs than we are. But we've evolved to develop our beautiful, complex brain in the context of relationships. Relationships with parents, relationships with grandparents, relationships with siblings, with teachers, and with other children. And in the context of a rich set of relationships, the brain has what it needs to develop. And we especially argue that in the context of relationships where there is serve and return, where the baby produces a signal and the environment responds appropriately, that baby is able to feed its brain. It sort of has its own little curriculum. Today, I'm interested in lights. We're going to look at lights. Lights are really cool. Oh, that was so yesterday. Today, we're going to, feel the rug and the texture of the rug, and that's what's going to make me happy. So babies guide their learning according to what it is they're interested in context where they are experiencing lovely serve and return kind of relationships with others, in high quality childcare and in supportive care from parents and other relatives. And this matters. This is a study that is based on socioeconomic class, but we know that SES is important because it's actually a proxy for the kinds of stimulation that parents are able to support and provide to their babies. This study was done in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, actually from some people out of Madison, the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And what they did was with the same babies, they imaged the baby's brain matter, the gray matter of the brain repeatedly from the time the babies were 5 months until they were 36 months. And at 5, 6, 7, 9 months, the size of the brain, the actual total gray matter did not differ as a function of social class. But what you can see is that by age 3, we see the presence of the inequity of what happens to kids who live in different social contexts. That the children from high SES homes where they were exposed to all sorts of wonderful learning experiences have brains that are actually larger, better connected than children from low SES homes who did not have these opportunities. And we think it really is not the income level, but the experiences that the children have that really matter. And what this means is by the time kids get to preschool, they are coming into preschool with brains that are differently developed. Now, that doesn't mean they can't rebound, but it means that you have to work much harder if you're not already prepared to learn. So why is poverty so bad for the brain? We know from a number of studies that there are a number of sort of building blocks for why this is true. Poor nutrition, food deserts, problems with having the right micronutrients that you need, poor and unstable housing that puts your parents under an incredible amount of stress and also the baby under stress, harsh discipline that results from the experience of being a very stressed parent, low serve and return interactions as parents work 2 or 3 jobs just to keep the family in the housing. They don't have time to do all that nice interaction with the children, and the experience of toxic stress for both the parents and for the infant, high degrees of stressors. When you remove these things or control for them, there's no SES effect on brain development. When they're present, that's when we see these effects. And with this, I want to really remind you how important place matters. The physical environments where children live affect their development and their health. The qualities of the conditions in which people live are not evenly or randomly distributed. They're shaped by and deeply rooted in public policies and societal histories and things that we can collectively get together and work at changing. Now, I don't know if many of you know of this. It's being used increasingly in research. It's called the Child Opportunity Index. This is the second iteration of this. These measures have been collected and analyzed by geocodes. And if you're interested, you can go into the Child Opportunity Index, put in your geocode for your neighborhood and see what the opportunity index is in these different areas for your geocode. And we know that for kids growing up in areas where there's lower opportunities, including opportunities for high quality childcare, but also other things like 3rd grade reading proficiency, the whole area here, that we see that their development is often compromised. It's much more challenging. And we know that these are really not equitably distributed. These are data from 100 cities where the CDI has been done and analyzed by race. And what you see there in the middle is the median, the national median. And white children are living, generally speaking, in geocodes that have higher than the national median for the CDI, as are Asian children, but not Hispanic children and not Black children. These things are not equitably distributed. So as we think about the importance of quality early childhood, we have to think about the critical importance of supporting that, especially in neighborhoods where the CDI is low, where children are going to be having to overcome really intense disparities. Now, I mentioned that toxic stress ain't so good for you. When we think about stress, we'd like to think about 3 levels, actually. There's positive stress. Wrapping your baby and child in bubble wrap is like the worst thing you can do. They need brief periods of increases in heart rate and mild increases in stress hormones as they go about and bumble around in the world and learn that they can manage. We think about tolerable stress as serious, temporary stress responses, but that are buffered by supportive relationships and may actually become learning opportunity for kids. What we worry about is this thing we call toxic stress. Is prolonged activation of stress response systems because the child is lacking a supportive relationship, or the relationships itself that the child has to rely on are actually the source of the stress. So there's this approach avoidance conflict that the child has to deal with all the time. Toxic stress, these stress levels produce this increased production of a stress hormone called cortisol, which is what I study. And the presence of this hormone in different regions of the brain has pretty potent effects if it's chronic and elevated. What you're seeing here on the left is a normal brain cell. There's the nucleus in the middle and all of its connections, and one where they've actually gone in and dumped cortisol on that nerve cell. And what you see is that the stress hormone causes a retraction of all these connections. And if we actually look on these little connections, those little bumps, that's actually what a synapse looked like. And that's the places where the brain cell connects with others. And what you can see is under chronic stress, you get a reduction, you get a retraction of those synapses. This is actually the cell's attempt to preserve itself so that it doesn't, in essence, undergo what's called apoptosis and actually kill itself from overproduction of catabolic and energy using behavior. Now, what's interesting is if we look in the brain, this region, which is called the hippocampus, very important for memory and learning, experiences that kind of reduction in connections with chronic stress. This reason is the amygdala. It's important for fear learning. And it actually, when you put cortisol in it, it actually increases in its activity. And this is the prefrontal cortex that's important for planning and self-regulation. It also experiences that contraction. So what sort of nature is up to is under chronic stress, we shape a brain that acts now and thinks later, which is probably important for preserving the individual in a dangerous situation. You don't want to say, oh, that's a lion. Now, what do I know about lions? No, you want to run and say, why was I running? Oh, there was a lion. But it makes it very difficult for kids to function in school. And this is sort of the basis of working on trauma-informed education, trauma-informed care, where you don't say what's wrong with you, child, but what has happened to you and how can I create a situation where you feel safe enough that you actually can stay in a reflective mode and not kick in a defensive posture. Now, I've indicated that in supportive relationships, the brain develops beautifully. It's also in supportive relationships, we see resilience, and the capacity to be resilient to stress is also being built. One of the ways we look at this is using the Ainsworth-Strange situation to classify children as securely or insecurely attached based on how they use the parent in those situations to provide them with a sense of security, how they organize their security-seeking behavior around the parent. Even if they get upset, we can tell that they're using the parent as a secure base. One of the things that I've studied a long time ago was how powerful a secure attachment relationship is in buffering children from stress. And I do this by quite literally sending in the clowns. One of the things we did with toddlers is we confronted them with a live clown. Never have a clown at your toddler's birthday party, a really bad idea because some kids are really frightened of clowns. And what we found is that the children who were really frightened and in secure attachment relationships with the parent who was with them did not elevate the stress hormone, just like the kids who weren't frightened. But those who were frightened and in an insecure relationship did elevate. And we know that in high quality childcare settings, children can form, if not secure attachments, secure relationships to their childcare provider and are able to have their experiences of stress buffered. But we also know that in poorer quality childcare settings, we see an elevation in stress hormones over the course of the day, day after day after day. So we need high quality childcare that provides children with a safe and secure environment to explore and that protects their developing brain from hyper response of the stress system. We also know that for children growing up in poverty, although it is much more difficult, if you look on the left, for parents who are raising their children below 150% of the federal poverty limit to create a secure attachment relationship with their child, if they are able to, now we're looking on the right, and we used going to your doctor and having an exam and a shot as our stressor. If they are able to, those children who are in secure relationships are very powerfully buffered from stress, whereas those who are not and growing up in poverty are experiencing much more of a stress activation. So in summary, the architecture of the brain is shaped by our experiences. Skills beget skills. Poor early foundations affect what comes after. Brain architecture develops in the context of relationships and in the context of high quality child opportunity neighborhoods that support parents and children. Serve and return provides the experiences that literally build the brain. Poverty is bad for the brain, poor nutrition, poor housing, harsh discipline, etc. Toxic stress can literally shape an anxious and fearful brain that acts first and thinks later. And there are structural problems that we as a society can address. So how can we act? We can get it right the first time. We can provide brains with what they need to develop. It's more physiologically reasonable. And it costs less to society than remedial education and clinical treatment, and certainly crime. We can help children build resilience. We can provide adequate stimulation for brain development from the beginning. We can work to reduce and eliminate toxic stress in childhood, and remember, place matters. And we can increase the support and protective factors that support children and families, including high quality childcare. And this next page just lists a number of things that my colleague Ann Maston would call ordinary magic, the things that we need in order to support the healthy development of all children. So thank you, and I'm available to answer questions at the end.
Fantastic. Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate it.
Stop sharing. There we go.
Great. And now we're going to pivot to Miss Amy Wazlawik. As she's putting on her screen, if you can think of some questions for Dr. Gunnar, then please put them in your question and answer thing, and we'll get to those at the end. So Ms. Wazlawik, let's hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Amy Wazlawik. I am the principal assistant for Ramsey County Commissioner Nicole Frethem. She represents District 1 on the Ramsey County Board, and that includes Shoreview, Arden Hills, Mounds View, Gem Lake, Wiper Township, and parts of Blaine and Spring Lake Park. And I think I missed one, but that's the general area of her district. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is building off of what Dr. Gunnar started us with, is really the early care and learning and some of the challenges and solutions that we see at the state level, primarily at the state level, since we are sort of a local focus league here. Some of the challenges that we see with early care and learning in our state, and then some of the potential solutions that we have to these issues. And I do want to point out that there's a really good reason why early care and learning, while those two go, there's an and between them, because care and learning are inseparable with young children. So as Dr. Gunnar pointed out, you have the serve and return, you have the interactions between the child and the adults, and the child and the environment, and the child and other children or other people in the environment. And that helps build the brain architecture. It helps children learn, but there's a lot of basic things like those interactions, like speaking, reading, singing, playing, children observing that are part of that learning process, but also part of the care that happens in a childcare setting or in with a child's loved ones. Next slide, please. So first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about the state of sort of early care and learning in Minnesota. So generally speaking, childcare is what we consider a broken market. So essentially what you have is you have very high costs for families, so issues with affordability for a lot of families, and you also have low wages for childcare workers. And so in Minnesota, we have actually the 6th highest childcare costs in the country. In 2021, the average infant care rate was $16,164 per year, which is about the same as tuition and fees for 1 year of resident tuition at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. And at the same time that amount was a lot of money for a lot of families, the 2021 median wage for childcare workers in Minnesota was $29,430 a year. So that's what they were making on average, the median wage for childcare workers in the state. The poverty rate for early educators is 18.8%, and that's about double the poverty rate for the general population in the state of Minnesota. I think one of the things that Dr. Gunnar pointed out that goes along with this is the cost of high quality childcare. And so that is often even higher than the cost that we see listed here, because you want to have trained staff, and you want to have high quality environments and high quality facilities and lots of engaging materials for the kids to use. And so that's another piece of it, is that the cost of high quality care can sometimes be higher, and we know that the quality is really important. So we know that the quality has a positive impact on kids and families, and we know that those lower quality programs can actually have a negative impact on kids and their development. So we want to ensure that the programs are high quality, but we know that means in some cases that can mean even more inaffordability for families. Next slide, please. All right, and along with the broken market, we also have pretty significant economic impact. So my arrow turned out a little weird there, but what we see is a lack of childcare slots. And we saw this a lot. I think a lot of us realized this during the pandemic, when a lot of childcare options were closed for families, that families had to try and find something to do with their children while they were maybe doing some of their own work from home. And so having to figure out what to do with their kiddos made it a lot harder for them to continue to work, whether they were doing that at home or outside of the home. So the lack of childcare slots, regardless of where it happens, greater Minnesota metro area of the state, is a big driver of the lack of workers, especially now when we're in a time where we already have a workforce shortage, a pretty severe workforce shortage, especially in particular fields. The lack of childcare slots only makes that worse, because you have families who would be working, members of families who would be working, parents or others who would be working if they had childcare, but they are unable to find affordable, accessible childcare, and therefore are either not in the labor market or only in the labor market part-time, because that's what they can afford to do with the cost of childcare and the hours they work. A 2016 national survey of children's health, so this was several years ago, so it's not quite up to date, but even at that time, there were 30,000 plus Minnesota parents of children under the age of 5 who had to quit a job, not take a job, or greatly change a job because of problems with childcare. So we have a significant number of workers in Minnesota who are having their ability to work disrupted by lack of accessible, affordable childcare. There's an organization called Ready Nation, and they actually put out a report. I believe this is in one of the past maybe 3 or 4 years. And the report actually found that in the country itself, the total lost earnings, productivity, and tax revenue because of a lack of childcare for young children clocks in at around $122 billion. So when we think of a lot of the funds that the federal government has, or even the state, that's about, in my head, I'm calculating that's a little bit more than double our entire state budget. Depending on which year you look at, our budget has been around 50-some billion dollars a year. And so if you calculate that in and you think about what Minnesota as a state spends money on, whether that's education, healthcare, roads and bridges, a variety of different things, think about that amount, that 50-some billion, and now take that 122 billion and think about what you could do with that, whether in Minnesota or elsewhere and across the entire country, what we could do if we had those lost earnings, the lost tax revenue, and the lost productivity back into the economy. So it's a very big economic impact. And we're seeing, I think there's sort of mixed issues or mixed results across the state. So in In rural greater Minnesota, we're seeing a number of family childcare is a big sort of, that's the typical method of providing childcare in greater Minnesota, because there are usually not enough children in each community to be able to open a childcare center with multiple classrooms and multiple teachers. And so family childcare providers who have a childcare business running out of their homes, those are often the models that are well used in greater Minnesota, because they work better for those communities. Over the past several decades, we've seen a lot of family childcares close, and since there are a higher percentage of those family childcare facilities are in greater Minnesota, that means it's hitting rural communities harder. And it sort of begins this vicious cycle of, you know, the rural areas lose their childcare, then they lose workforce because people can't find childcare in those areas, and so they're not moving to those areas to work. And then that has an impact on the economic vitality of those areas in greater Minnesota. So it's sort of a cycle, and it's really important that we break that cycle, and that we do everything that we can to encourage not just family childcare providers, but different models of childcare in greater Minnesota in particular, to ensure that we have that economic vitality in greater Minnesota as well as the metro, to ensure that we're seeing those economic benefits and the economic mobility across the state. Next slide, please. All right, I'm just going to cover a little bit about what's been done. So there have been, which probably isn't surprising to anyone who knows anything about government, but there's been a lot, like things take a long time. In the most cases, when you're talking about big system-wide concerns and issues, whether that's in childcare, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's roads and bridges, whatever it might be, bonding projects, things that we want to get done often take a long time to get done. And that could be because of funding issues. It could be because of political will. It could be because of, different ideologies of folks who are in power, who have the money, who have the power to invest the money. Maybe they don't agree on how to do it. And so over the past several years, there has been some work done on the issue of childcare. There was a legislative task force on access to affordable childcare, and their report and recommendations came out, I believe, in 2017. And what they found is, it's very similar to what we've actually seen in the last several years with continued work on this issue. So a lot of the issues that came up in 2017 with this report and recommendations didn't necessarily get solved right away. And again, some of this is funding issues. Some of it is also having the willingness of both legislators and agencies to be able to, the willingness and the resources to be able to implement some of these changes. So few examples that I just wanted to give from that report and recommendations. There was conversations about raising the reimbursement rates for our Child Care Assistance Program, which is the program that is largely funded by federal funds that provides child care assistance payments to low-income families to help them them send their children to high-quality child care programs. And so there was some work that was suggested in that program to make it increase reimbursement rates so that providers got reimbursed more, hoping that providers would take more families who used CCAP would accept CCAP because those reimbursement rates were higher and they were getting paid more. There was conversation around training difficulties for childcare providers. There was conversation around a number of different issues to do with family childcare providers in particular. And some of the items in that report, I would say, none of the sort of large scale items, but some of the items were things that were addressed, and then some of them came up later in the next piece, which is the Family Child Care Task Force. These are not in order of year, but they're sort of in order of relevance here. So the Family Child Care Task Force, I was co-chair of that task force when I was in the legislature, along with former Senator Mary Kiffmeyer, and it was a pretty big group. We had legislators and childcare providers and parents and folks from state agencies and the counties and different stakeholder groups who were on that task force. And our focus, as you can see from the title, was really on family childcare. So given the amount of family childcare businesses that we saw had been closing over the preceding years, there was a concern that this was a particular group of providers that was sort of bearing the brunt of these closures. And so we wanted to learn more from this specific group of providers and what they needed from the state and from the agencies and from the counties to be able to stay in the field, or for folks to be able to start a business in the field of childcare and stick with it. And so what we found from the Family Childcare Task Force, not surprising again, is a lot of the things that didn't get done from that original report and recommendations from 2017 came up again in the Family Childcare Task Force. And so it was a lot of things around, wanting to see a different sort of, our regulations hadn't been updated for years, if not decades. And so having some sort of broad scale update of the regulations governing family childcare. So these are things like licensing, and these are just general regulations around childcare, family childcare, and wanting those to be updated and wanting there to be sort of a better system in place for saying, these are safety concerns, these are not, flagging concerns, just dealing with concerns a different way. So we're not always saying, like, if this one little thing happens at a family childcare, we're not instantly, we're giving them a warning as opposed to a bigger penalty. So wanting to make sure that the consequences for any sort of deviation from the regulations are sort of at the same level as what that infraction might be. So we're not overblowing things and providing, some harm, giving some harmful actions to providers. So that was one thing that came out of the Family Childcare Task Force. There was also a lot about training in terms of what family childcare providers wanted to see in training, wanting to have a wider variety of trainings, wanting to be able to have some things count as multiple areas of training so that they could get more of their training done in a shorter period of time. It's a lot of training that's required, as it should be, because they're taking care of our kiddos, but it can be onerous on the providers and the staff that work with them if they are having to do all that training. I will say another piece of that was just having more resources for family childcare providers. So discussions about like mentors and shared services, whether that's accounting services or some other services where childcare providers themselves may not be able to pay for those services, but they would be able to pool their resources with other family childcare providers and get those services. So ideas like that, things to offer more support and resources for family childcare providers. And from there, the OLA, the Office of the Legislative Auditor, which is it's essentially an office that audits programs at the state and looks at things that the state funds and examines how they're doing and has different metrics that it uses to measure these different programs. And the OLA released a report on early childhood programs in 2018. And a couple of the big findings from that, and again, this is not surprising if you've been paying attention to these conversations, but one of the big pieces that came out of that report was simplifying the eligibility and funding for childcare programs. So we have a number of programs that serve young kids in the state of Minnesota. And we also have several different funding streams that fund those various programs. And so the problems we were seeing was the system was very fragmented. And so it was hard for families to access those programs, to know what all was available, to know what the eligibility was. It was not the same for every program. And so one of the big recommendations from this report was actually to align the funding and eligibility, or the eligibility criteria for the programs to start with, because that was something that would be easier you would have a better understanding, and families would have a better understanding, and providers would have a better understanding of what programs a family is qualified for. And so when they were looking for some sort of assistance, they would be able to have a clearer understanding of if you qualify for this one, then you also qualify for this one. So that's something that the OLA report was a big piece of the recommendation. And then there were some other recommendations along with sort of the outcomes of these programs. So wanting to make sure that there were measures in place assessments in place to measure the outcomes. So we actually see is this program effective? Is this child ready to move on to preschool or kindergarten? And then also data sharing. So not only are these programs effective, but how do we know that? And how are we communicating that within programs so that we know what services families are getting and we know what impact they're having on families. Finally, this was a much more recent task force, and they just wrapped up their work in early this year. the Great Start for All Minnesota Children Task Force. And that was it sort of came out of the family child, not entirely, but there were some parts of it from the Family Childcare Task Force where we sort of realized, these are not just problems that family childcare face. There's a lot of these things that are facing the field as a whole, and other issues that we sort of saw big picture wise. My first slide was about the broken market. And so the Great Start for All Minnesota Children Task Force, one of their big responsibilities was really to figure out how do we make this work and what can the state do to invest in early care and learning to ensure that it's accessible and affordable for all Minnesota families. Next slide, please. All right, so here we have a little bit of information about the Great Start for All Minnesota Children Task Force. The goal was really to develop a state plan to ensure that all Minnesota families have access to affordable, high quality early care and education opportunities. It was a fairly large group, again, having lots of stakeholders from different areas as members, voting members, and non-voting members. 11 voting members appointed by the governor, 4 appointed by legislative leadership. That's primarily the majority and minority leaders in the House and Senate, and then 22 non-voting members appointed by varying individuals. Those might be the childcare associations in the state. Those might be a quality rating system, Parent Aware, different individuals or organizations appointed those individuals. And as I note here, it included legislators, childcare providers, parents, agency and organization staff, and other stakeholders as part of this larger task force, figuring out what was the plan going forward. They released their report on February 1st, 2023. If you go to the next slide, I'll do a brief summary. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. The task force report is very long. It is available on the website for the task force, so folks can go and kind of look at that themselves. It's a very long report, and even the recommendation section is pretty lengthy and pretty detailed. But what I will say is these were the 4 sort of guiding principles for the task force recommendations. So creating a family benefits program that provides affordable access to early care and education for all families. And one big piece of this for the Great Start Task Force was the goal was sort of affordability was 7% of income. So no family is paying more than 7% of their income for early care and education in our state. And they wanted to see, when it comes to affordability, there were also conversations about lower income families not paying as much, and then the higher income families paying a little bit more of their income. So having that cap at 7%, but then having the levels vary based on the income of the families. There was also conversations about sort of, what does quality mean and where does that play in? That's part of the conversation as well. Providing early childhood programs with adequate funding to deliver effective services for children and families, and paying the early care and education workforce a living wage. So those 2 things often go hand in hand because, again, a lot of the money that goes into our early childhood programs is going directly to our early care and education workforce who are providing care and services for the children who are in these programs. So wanting to see more investment in things like, right now we have early learning scholarships. Our 2 primary funding vehicles are early learning scholarships and the Childcare Assistance Program. And so wanting to see more funding put into those programs so we can serve more children. And then also so that we can look at how do we increase pay for the early care and education workforce who's really doing this important work of building the brain infrastructure of our youngest kids. And then also
explain what the scholarships are, because I don't know that everybody understands how those scholarships work, and they're important.
Yeah, I think that's on one of my slides in the next few, but yeah, I can explain that. So the scholarships are, there's a couple of different ways they can be used. So there's a couple of different pathways, and some of them go to specific organizations or like schools, and some of them are portable that families can take with them and go to where they want to go. And essentially it's a certain amount of money based on income that families get so they can put their child into a high quality early care and education program. This program was started several years ago now. It's relatively new. CCAP has been around for a long time. The scholarships program is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. And so this was a way for us to try and provide additional funding for families who maybe didn't qualify for CCAP, or who maybe had income a little bit higher than that, so that they were able to also send their kids to these high quality early care and education programs. And one of the issues with scholarships that's come up as we've sort of seen this play out is that there hasn't always been enough money because of the high cost of childcare, that the scholarships don't always cover an entire year of childcare for a given child. So you might have a child who is in a childcare program with an early learning scholarship, and then that money runs out in September if they started at the beginning of the year, or if it's a school year, that money ran out in April. And so they may not be able to cover the entire year with the scholarship funding. And so one of the pieces of the conversation has been, along with expanding, just giving more money to the program, is also saying, these scholarships should cover the entire cost of the program for a child for a given year. So instead of having a family have to drop out of childcare or find other childcare, allowing the child to stay in that childcare program is both easier on the family, but it's also better for the children because they build relationships with the caring adults who are caring for them in the childcare program. And it's pretty disruptive and can be, it's very disruptive for kids to take them away from that adult that they built a relationship over the course of several months. So this is a piece of the conversation that's, I think, been had sort of since the scholarship program rolled out, is like, how do we try and make sure that this is not only serving more families broadly, but that it's serving families so that they're able to keep their child in childcare for the entirety of the year. Next slide, please. All right, so first piece of legislation that came out of the task force recommendations was called the Great Start for All Minnesota Children Act. And it was developed by early care and learning advocates, and it was based on many of the Great Start task force recommendations. So a lot of the things that are on these slides in this act are that came directly from the Great Start for All Minnesota Children, their report that came out earlier this year. So establishing the Great Start Scholarships Program. So this would essentially be mashing together the early learning scholarships and CCAP and making it in a program that has, the same eligibility across the program. So it's less onerous for families and for providers to figure out who qualifies, because it would all be under one program. And then you would have, again, those affordability levels based on income. It also makes changes to the Childcare Assistance Program. So expanding the definition of family to include more people, increasing the rates paid to childcare providers to the 75th percentile, which is actually what is recommended. So it's essentially, it's a percentile mark of, you take a market rate survey and then you set rates based on that market rate survey at the 75th percentile. And that's, Minnesota is one of the states with the lowest rates when it comes to that program. And so we're very far behind, and we really need to see that increased. It also centralizes provider registration, which is a help for providers. The bill would have also made changes to early learning scholarships, so expanding eligibility on that as well, expanding that to include kids age 0 to 3, and then adding additional priority groups who can receive those scholarships. Next slide, please. So the Great Start Act also would provide retention payments to providers. So wanting to ensure that we're keeping folks who are in the field by providing those retention payments for them. And then a big piece of it, this was a big, it's a big long-term piece of the Great Start for All Minnesota Children, their task force recommendations too, is directing the Department of Human Services to develop a wage scale and a cost estimation model for early care and learning. So right now, as I noted, for example, the CCAP rates are set based on a market survey, but that isn't really it's not really getting the true cost of what it costs to provide high quality care. And so the idea is that the Department of Human Services would actually look at what does it cost to provide high quality early care and education for young children, and use that as a model for all of these programs, and setting up, what the amounts would be, as opposed to this market survey that's really only looking at what people are charging and using that as a guideline. So this is a much more comprehensive way of looking at the problem, and especially when we think about family childcare and all of the things that, running a business out of their home, all of what that entails is a cost that doesn't necessarily get considered when we're just looking at what are different providers across the state charging families. And then the Great Start Act also had a provision that would essentially provide any childcare program that met basic licensing requirements would get a 1-star parent aware rating. Parent aware is the program that rates childcare facilities and centers that take part in the program, and it's our quality rating system that we use in the state. And then it would appropriate money to update IT systems. So my boss, Commissioner Frethem, is a big proponent of this. She's been sort of pushing this idea for a long time. The systems that we use, a lot of the state systems that we use are very outdated. The one that we use in particular for a lot of our childcare functions is essentially, if anyone ever played Oregon Trail with the green screen and the pixels, it's actually worse than that. It's older than that. So I played that when I was in elementary school. And so that's how old our computer system, that's sort of the basis of the computer system that we use for this. And considering the large amount of funding that goes out through the system, there's a really big need to update that system and make sure that people going into the future, that people know how to use it, both the people on the back end, the people doing the coding and doing the upkeep on the back end, and the frontline workers on the front end. So the county workers that are processing applications and doing other sort of stuff that they need to do, that we're actually moving into 2023 and not living with technology that's decades old. Next slide, please. All right. As is usually the case with a lot of things, we have these sort of pie in the sky goals, and then we get told how much money we have, and we have to sort of cut back based on that. So budget targets were released, after the Great Start Act was sort of introduced, and there was, we had been looking at about $5 to $6 billion, billion with a B, dollars to do essentially the entire Great Start for All Minnesota Children Act. And when it came to it, I believe the entire committee, the Children and Families Committee, I believe their budget target was somewhere around 1.17 billion. And that's for childcare, child support, homelessness. There's a whole bunch of things that fall under that committee's jurisdiction that were part of that funding, would be part of that funding target. So obviously that's far short of what we would have needed to fully implement the Great Start for All Minnesota Children Act. But it was something, and there were pieces. If you want to go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about what did get put in the bill. So with the budget target release, we sort of had to temper expectations and sort of look at what we could actually do with the funding and what sort of policy versus funding decisions we could make. So essentially what the Children and Families Omnibus Bill, and I'm talking about the House bill here. So the Senate bill did a lot of the same things, but numbers were different. So a lot of the same things were done in both, but some numbers were different. And there were a few differences between the bills because of the jurisdiction of the committee in the Senate and the House. But this is the House bill that I'm referring to. So the House Omnibus Bill for the Children and Families Committee established the Great Start Scholarship Program. So that was a recommendation of the task force. So this is something that just establishing this program to begin with as a thing, as an entity, is something that the task force recommended. The bill also expands early learning scholarship eligibility and increases funding for the program. So there is additional funding going into the early learning scholarship pot of money. And that eligibility was also going to expand to include the younger kids as well. And so this was, I think part of this was I think some of this was in the task force recommendations. Some of the eligibility and expanding definitions of family were a little bit different, but a lot of the stuff that, the simpler stuff that we had already sort of started doing, that the task force wanted to continue, was what got done. So expanding eligibility for CCAP and increasing the rates, because as I said, Minnesota has some of the lowest reimbursement rates in the country. Permanently reprioritizing the basic sliding fee waiting list. So the waiting list that exists for families to get assistance, reprioritizing that so that families that need the assistance can get that, and trying to eliminate the wait list is essentially what we're trying to do there. Providing stabilization transition grants, and then establishing this Great Start compensation support payments. So during, I want to say, I can't remember if that was 2020, but during the pandemic, during the heart of the pandemic, there was money that came in from the feds, and there was also some state money that we put in to support childcare providers. So it was essentially to say, we know that a lot of childcare providers are closed, or they're when things open back up a little bit, that they they were not getting as many kids back in their programs and therefore weren't bringing in as much revenue that they would need to pay staff and stay open. And so the legislature provided, and the governor worked together to provide money to provide stabilization grants for childcare providers across the state to try and ensure that they could stay open. We had already seen that decrease in family childcare providers, and we didn't want to see a further decrease in those, and we didn't want to see any sort of decrease in the centers as well. So that was something that we continued, the stabilization transition grants, and then this compensation support payments for providers to help them as well. Next slide, please.
We'll
All right, and then
close it up pretty quick, Amy. So
yep, I saw you pop up, and I figured that was what was going on. And then here's just more of the omnibus bill. So the wage scale and cost estimation model were in there as well. A shared services alliance, which I mentioned earlier about family childcare, technology grants, and then I have the wage scale on here twice. Technology grants, and then next slide, please. There is some IT funding in there, and then there's also some childcare grants through DEED, the Department of Employment and Economic Development. So there's some childcare grants there as well that are separate from this omnibus bill. Next slide, please. So here's where things are right now. At the legislature, omnibus bills are being debated and passed right now. So several of them have already been passed in either the House or the Senate. And then conference committees will be established if necessary to resolve the differences between the House and Senate versions of the bills. And then next slide, what people can do, this is related, but because of how far along we are in session right now, it's sort of tricky to sort of point to one thing that people can do. But essentially, what would be a good ask is to contact your legislators and tell them that you want to see robust investments in early care and learning. So making sure that, the amounts that currently exist in the House and Senate, whichever one has the most amount, wanting to make sure those amounts stay the same and that we're not decreasing the funding, because we're already getting less than we sort of hoped for. And so wanting to make sure we can keep that as high as possible is really important.
Well, thank you. And if Dr. Gunnar can come on too, we'll go to a next set of slides just while we're gathering things. I'm afraid we've come to 8 o'clock, so we really only have time for a couple brief comments afterwards. I did want to ask one question that the audience had said. We're getting really positive feedback to both of you. Thank you very much. And I've got a slide up here that has some resources that if you want to take your phone and take a picture of it, you can certainly do that and look up some of these references. But for both of you, any quick comment on what it takes to become a child care provider, not a babysitter, not a daycare person, but a child care provider of a good quality program? Do you feel that this needs to be college education? Does this have wiggle room for different tiers of people like they've talked about with teachers? Do you have a 20-second answer, both of you, that you could give us on that?
Yeah, I can
Think
start.
Small. I'm on the board of Think Small. And part of what Think Small does is it deals with these scholarships, but it also does training for childcare providers and supports childcare providers as they move through the quality ratings. And they have a grow your own program for people who are not college educated, but where they work together with people who know how to provide high quality childcare and can have that kind of training. So I think you don't have to go to college. One good thing about an early childhood education program is you can think through the solutions to problems because you have a deep background. So you're not just implementing a curriculum. But nonetheless, there's a lot of support out there, potentially through places like Think Small, as people are getting trained higher up in these quality rating schemes. And one thing that we know is that if you have this kind of training, then you're more likely to be able to weather the storm too, because more of those 3- and 4-star places that were being supported didn't close during this time. So that's partially an answer.
Amy, any quick question before?
Yeah, I will just say I agree with Dr. Gunnar there, and I will say Ramsey County actually has put in resources to try and get more people into the field. So they have, I think it's called the Child Development Academy. I'm getting my my acronyms mixed up. And that's essentially to get more folks into the field. So other ways that we can do it besides just organizations like Think Small is actually having counties say, we know this is a priority and we're going to invest in getting folks into the field. And that's what they've done.
And it's critically important to get people of color able to open their own to take care of children of color.
Great.
That's generally true starting from the beginning and not just once they hit elementary school.
Yeah. And Beatrice, if we could have the slides back up, the league presentation. I'd just like to end here with the front page of the January 3rd, 2023 Minneapolis Star Tribune. And say that it's up to us citizens to ensure this becomes true by voting, by talking to our neighbors and friends about the issue of high quality childcare, and by by contacting our representatives and senators. Next slide. Here's just a piece of an email I received from my state rep, and many of you probably got the same one with the specifics. And so this is the kind of action item. Please contact them and say, yes, I support this. I want money to go to these programs. We know how critical it is for the very youngest of our society to get good, high quality childcare. Next slide. So just briefly, over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has worked as a citizens league. We're nonpartisan, we're a membership organization, and we're devoted to you. Next slide. We've got a quiet voting year, but here's our election calendar, and there will be local ballot questions and school board seats. Look for Vote 411. It's a website that will help you make informed voting decisions. Next slide. The St. Paul League, the Minnesota League, and National League websites all have information about membership. We would love you to give us a try. And finally, thank you both, Dr. Gunnar and Ms. Wazlawik. You've just filled our heads. I hope the audience is ready to tackle this as understanding really that for brain development and for the good of our society, we just have to pay attention to the littlest ones among us. And hopefully this will bring this issue to the forefront. Thanks to the Roseville area and White Bear Lake Area League for supporting us, and SCC and SPNN. And thank you for coming tonight. Thanks for staying on. Sorry we went a little late. We had a million questions we didn't get to. I'm sorry, but it was so interesting. And our next program is May 23rd. We'll have some recently elected local officials for you to meet. So thank you. Thank you, speakers. Good night, everyone. Have a pleasant evening.